Section 30 of Crime as Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 3. Penalties anthropologically adapted to the sex, age, etc. of the criminal and to the nature of the crime. Subchapter 219. Sex. As I have shown in Chapter 14, and in my Female Offender, we may conclude that the true-born criminal exists among women only in the form of the prostitute, who already finds in her lamentable calling a substitute for crime. Most female criminals are the only criminals from accident or passion, passing frequently from one to the other of these two classes. They very rarely show the type and tendencies of the criminal, and commit only from 11% to 20% as many crimes as men. They lead, it is true, in poisoning, abortion, and infanticide, but of the highway robberies, only 6% to 8% are committed by women. When we add that the crimes which are more essentially feminine, such as abortion and infanticide, are just those for which there is least need of punishment, being almost always committed at the suggestion of the lover or husband, it is often sufficient to separate the criminals. The penalty for the greater number of female criminals could be limited to a reprimand with suspended sentence, except in the very rare cases of poisoning, swindling, or homicide, in which it would be necessary to confine the offender in a convent, where, on account of the great susceptibility to suggestion, religion could be substituted for the eroticism that is the most frequent cause of their crimes. I have had proofs of this in a cellular prison under my charge, where, however, the nuns and attendants were not especially well fitted for their duties. As for those who relapse 2 or 3 times into sexual crimes, the only method would be to enroll them in the official list of prostitutes, which would have the advantage of preventing clandestine prostitution, much the most harmful sort. Recognizing the great importance which women attach to dress and ornament, we may often in minor offences, such as thefts, brawls, and slanders, replace a prison sentence by penalties which will touch female vanity, such as cutting the hair, etc. In adopting special penalties for women, we shall only be returning to usages of the ancients, the Jews and the Germans. In Russia in the Middle Ages, a woman who struck her husband had to ride upon an ass with her face toward the tail. In England, women who quarrelled among themselves had to go through the village with a weight chained to their foot. Slanderers and busybodies had to wear a muzzle. Conrad Keltz writes in his De origine situ moribus et institutionibus domain. Women who have been brought in disrepute because of witchcraft or superstitious practices, or have been guilty of infanticide or abortion, have various punishments inflicted upon them, being either sewed up in sacks and drowned, or even burned to death, or buried alive. Yet these cruel punishments are not sufficient to prevent their continually adding crime to crime. Subchapter 220. Abortion. The crimes of abortion which do not have professional gain for the object ought to be punished only by a reprimand or putting upon probation. It is to Balestrini that the credit is due for demonstrating that the procuring of an abortion ought not to be treated as a crime, for the lawmaker cannot in this matter pretend to be protecting the family, since this crime is most often committed by unmarried mothers just with the object of not creating an illegitimate family. Regarded as a defense of the person, such as law would have no force except where the abortion was procured without the consent of the mother. The abstract legal object is equally without standing, since society has nothing to gain from the birth of illegitimate children. The fiction of civil law which extends personally to unborn children cannot be characterized over into criminal law. The legal existence of the fetal life as a part of the social structure is, moreover, very contestable. An embryo does not represent a human being, but a being still at the stage of animalism, or rather a lower animal, which, in the earlier months, it would take an embryologist to recognize as human at all. No right is injured, then, by an abortion produced by a woman upon herself, not even by the danger which she incurs, no one being able to prevent another from injuring himself. We may add that indictments, and still more convictions, are very rare, and that there is a risk of an unjust conviction from the difficulty of obtaining certain proof except in very rare cases. In Italy in 1863, out of 9 women tried, 4 were acquitted. In 1870 there were 4 acquitted to 8 indictments, and in 1881 the same number to 13 indictments. In England from 1847 to 1849 there were only 3 cases of abortion tried. In 1850 there were 5, in 1851 4, in 1852 9, in 1853 17, out of which number there were 12 acquittals. In 1853 there was not a single trial for abortion in Scotland, and the same was true in Württemberg in 1853 to 54. And the rarity of convictions, 28%, not only casts ridicule upon the law, but also makes it appear that there is injustice in the rare cases where the penalty is exacted. Subchapter 221. Infanticide. All these arguments are applicable to infanticide also. Birth, the latter development of the embryo, is only an unjust cause of infamy to the woman without being any advantage to society, to which on the contrary it becomes a charge. For if the infant is abandoned, it is received into a foundling asylum, where it is legally assassinated, the mortality in these establishments being so great as to be like a permanent epidemic. Thus in Syracuse, the mortality of foundlings reaches 73%, at Modica 99%, and at Turin 50%. It may be objected that we ought not to interfere with the increase of the population, but in that case we ought to pass laws against onanism. All thinkers recognize that law is a relation of man to man, having for its object to make possible the existence of man in society, that it has 2 terms, man in society, but man only in so far as he is a member of society. In the case of the fetus, and in the case of the newly born child as well, we can recognize only one of these 2 terms fully. We may even say that the social element is completely lacking. It is evident in fact that both are rather under the guardianship of the mother, who constitutes their whole environment, than under that of society, of which they are still not directly a part. The alarms society for the life of an infant of whose existence is still ignorant. For infanticide, honorias causa, must necessarily take place before the birth of the infant is known, ought to be much less than that for the loss of an adult in the flower of his age. We must, then, deduct from the theoretical evil caused by the murder of the newborn child the amount of certain or probable evil which would come from the preservation of a life which exposes the father and mother to an irreparable loss of honour, compromises the peace of one family and sometimes of several, or, at least, in case the child is deserted, puts society in a perplexing situation. For on the one hand, the imperious voice of charity imposes upon society the necessity of receiving the innocent foundling, while on the other hand reason and experience teach that, by constantly accepting the bringing up of these children as an obligation, it incurs the risk of encouraging desertion and makes charity degenerate into a reward of immorality. As for the direct harm caused by infanticide, it consists in the suppression of an existence so threatened by the frequency of stillbirths and the great mortality of foundlings, that it does not all approach the harm done by an ordinary homicide. It is hardly necessary to add that a penitentiary sentence would have the infallible effect of depraving the woman, and of taking from her, together with a habit of housework, the means of rehabilitating herself when her term has expired. On the other hand, if we base the penalty upon the fear of a relapse, it can have no hold upon the infanticide, who is almost invariably a criminal by accident or by passion, rarely a recidivist. Probation with security for good behaviour is here, then, very generally sufficient. Limiting in this way the repressive measures against women, we shall prevent those decisions of judges and juries which seems so unjust when we compare the treatment of women with that of men. Out of 100 of each sex who came to trial at the Assize in Italy, 34 women and 31 men were acquitted, 31 women and 19 men before the tribunal, and 8 women and 6 men before the justices of the peace. In France, 25 women and 50 men were acquitted at the Assize, and in Russia, 31 women and 34 men. Subchapter 222. Age, Youth. Prison is still less the proper expedient for the youth of either sex. I have shown that there are offences which belong physiologically to childhood, such as cruelty to animals, theft of food, and cheating. What is really useful in these cases is what we may call moral nurture, putting them into the care of respectable and kindly families where the children will be well treated, and where they will be submitted to the proper sort of suggestion, so powerful at that age. Here they will be stimulated to continued activity for the satisfaction of their proper pride, and at the same time will be withdrawn from dissipation and idleness. Charitable institutions, agricultural colonies, and reform schools like Barnardo's, and that at Elmira, rendered more useful by the application of new ideas drawn from psychology and psychiatry and by immigration to agricultural centers, will prevent the occasional crime so frequent at that age, and will succeed in certain cases, if not in correcting, at least in usefully transforming the born criminal, and in any case will prevent him from contaminating others. For this purpose it is necessary to avoid the detention prison, which is the greatest source of corruption for youth. We speak, says Jolly, of the prisons of the Middle Ages, where they found a dead man between two sick men in the same bed. What we still do in our prisons is destined, I believe, to cause quite as much astonishment by and by. We put a person away in judgment who is innocent or perhaps only an occasional criminal in contact with the hardened offenders. France, with such promiscuities, transforms into malefactors children who have no tendency to crime. And all this has not even the advantage of making a selection, since, as Jolly very well observes, the children acquitted are worse than those convicted. It is for this reason that every violent correctional measure ought to be regarded as harmful, and we should turn to milder measures, especially remembering the great precocity of criminals. The limit of age at which we begin our application ought to be set at some little time before 9 years, and prolonged in the case of infantilism to a period considerably beyond that set by law. The limit should vary, also according to climate, race, profession, etc. The Semitic and Southern races are, for example, much more precocious in crimes of blood and in sexual crimes, and the poor and those who live in the country are slower to develop than the city dwellers and the rich. Subchapter 223. Old Age. The old man, unable to do harm, ought, like the child, to be spared the prison sentence. In his case, the common refuge, the workhouse, is sufficient. Here such inmates should be kept in separate apartments, with special precautions to prevent the contagion of evil and also escape. Only when the crime shows an unconquerable perversity should the old man be incarcerated in a regular prison. For the true criminals, by passion, remorse for crime is already the greatest of punishments. A fine, a judicial reprimand, or removal from the city or from the persons injured will be sufficient to protect society, to which they present no danger, and this treatment will leave them able to be useful because of the great altruism which is characteristic of their class. Subchapter 225. Political Criminals. Much the same way may be said of political criminals. If there is a crime which should be spared not only capital punishment, but even any severe punishment at all, it is that of the political criminal. This is especially true because many political criminals, if they are not criminals by passion, are insane and need the hospital more than the scaffold, and because even when they are criminals, their altruism renders them worthy of the greatest consideration, and often by having their altruism given another direction, they may be made useful to society. Louise Mitchell was called, in New Caledonia, the Red Angel, so devoted was she to the sick and unfortunate. Moreover, almost all political criminals are young, and it is in youth that heroism and fanaticism attain their highest degree. It is not possible to kill an idea by killing the man who has conceived it. On the contrary, it grows and perpetuates itself better in the glow of the matchless halo, all the more if it is true, while if it is false, it falls of itself. Furthermore, it is not possible to pass final judgment upon a man while he is alive, any more than a single generation can decide with certainty as to the falsity of an idea that has arisen under their own eyes. Russia has, for a long time, given us proofs of the uselessness of too severe laws against political criminals. Each of her terrible acts of repression by condemnation to a lingering death in the mines of Siberia has been followed by new and more violent reactions, and the same is true of France and Italy. Ravachol was not yet dead when he was turned into a demigod, and hymns were sung in Paris in his honour instead of the Marseillaise. There is nothing, writes one of our profoundest thinkers, G. Ferrero, more potent in exciting revolutionary tendencies than those legendary metrologies that stir the imagination of the numbers of fanatics with whom our society is swarming, and who are always an important element in all revolutionary movements. In every society there is a crowd of persons who need a martyr. They enjoy being persecuted and believing themselves the victims of human wickedness, They enroll themselves in the political parties which offer the most danger, just as certain mountain climbers choose the mountain that has the most dangerous precipices and the most inaccessible peaks. For all such, there is no more powerful incentive to embrace revolutionary theories than violent persecutions, and nothing is more dangerous than to give these exalted imaginations the corpse of an executed leader. That which characterizes these political criminals especially is a lack, which we might call specific, of adaptability to the form of government under which they are living. While born criminals show themselves unadaptable not only to the social environment of the nation in which they are found, but also to that of any nation of the same degree of civilization. For this reason, while born criminals must be eliminated from the civilized world, political criminals, who are such by passion, need simply be removed from the government and social environment by the people to whom they have proved unable to adapt themselves. Exile, as it existed in Roman law, and as it now exists in Abyssinia, and in serious cases, deportation, are then the penalties most appropriate for this class of criminals. But these penalties ought always to be temporary and revocable every 3 or 5 years at the will of Parliament, for before the expiration of the sentence public opinion may very well have changed. It is just for this reason that our school, while opposed to jury trial for ordinary crimes, accepts it in the case of political crimes as the only means of diagnosis which permits the recognition of whether the public opinion regards the offence in question as a crime. It was thus that formerly heresy was punished as the gravest possible crime, while to punish it today would seem ridiculous. It will be the same in a short time with crimes of lèse-majesté, strikes, and the pretended offences of socialistic thought. By this means we shall prevent those rare cases of rebellion which are, as we have seen, the beginnings of evolution. And this idea is neither revolutionary nor new, for it has already been applied in different countries and epochs, not really free governments. In Florence under the form of admonition, in Greece under that of ostracism, and in Sicily as petalism. In the Constitution of the United States, it is Congress itself which fixes the penalty for political crimes, and the same situation prevailed in the Roman Republic. But if the punishment for crimes provoked by political passion alone ought always to be temporary, in mixed political crimes, on the contrary, the penalty might be applied in a mixed form, that is to say, fixed for a certain term of years, corresponding to the legitimate social reaction, and indeterminate for another series of years, in order that it may be possible to interrupt it if the attack upon the political organization is no longer considered in the country as a crime. Subchapter 226. Occasional criminals. The same crime calls for a different penalty according as it is committed by a born criminal, a criminaloid, or an occasional criminal, and even at times in this latter case for no punishment at all. In this case it is essential to recognize the true motive. An offence that is really occasional and which excludes the thought of punishment is a theft of food by persons who are famished. Real punishment is equally inappropriate in all cases of involuntary offences, according to their opinion of Poglia, Pincero, and Capobianco. The amount of the damages to be paid left to the civil judges, for it would be unjust to regard a man as absolutely unfit to live in society, simply for the reason that through negligence or thoughtlessness, or by a pure accident which could not be repeated, he has committed a harmful act. If the same thing occurs repeatedly, it is possible that the simple dangers, a fine, a suspension from the office, act, or profession which have been the cause of the blamable act. Subchapter 227. Aid to suicide. Among the pretended crimes which the law punishes but which the public conscience absolves are those which Garofalo calls not natural but juridical, and which we shall call conventional. Aid to suicide is an example. If, leaving aside pure abstractions, we interrogate the science of life, we shall see, write Calusi and Ferry, that the interest of society in the existence of each of its members is not absolute, but that it decreases greatly, even ceases altogether in the case of voluntary death. On its side, biology shows us that in the struggle for existence it is the weakest, those least adapted to the social life, who succumb. Suicide is one of the forms of this defeat. It is, according to Haeckel, a safety valve for future generations to whom it spares a fatal heritage of nervous diseases with their consequent misery. It is, says Bergot, one of the instruments for the amelioration of the human race by the road of selection. Such is also the opinion of more steadily, and of myself. I have shown with Ferry that suicide is opposed to homicide, that is, a real safety valve, so that where one increases, the other decreases. On this side, then, suicide is a real advantage to the security of the state. Either, continues Ferry, you maintain that a man has not a right to dispose of his own life, and then you ought to punish the suicide, or else you recognize that suicide is not a crime, in that how can you punish the man who takes part in the suicide by aiding in it, just for taking part in what is no crime? For even if we cannot deny that the state exercises its repressive function for the purpose of defending its citizens as individuals in the case of crime against their safety, who does not see that real and voluntary consent of the victim removes any excuse for interference on the part of the state? Wherein do we feel our safety threatened when we learn that an individual has been killed at his own request? The Church alone can pretend to save the sinner in spite of himself. Subchapter 228, Defamation. The same may be said of the penalties decreed by the Italian Code against defamation having a political or social object. The work most often of men better than the normal, who have the courage to reveal to the public facts that pass for defamation only because the persons accused are powerful. These noble defamers are not to be feared, and they do no damage. They disobey the law only because it is imperfect. They are, then, pseudo-criminals, more worthy of praise and punishment. It is enough to make them show their good faith by furnishing proof of the facts or by retracting if they are deceived, especially since to lay bare our wounds is to begin their cure. Subchapter 229. The Duel. The situation is much the same with regard to the duel. Are we still subject to the tyranny of the custom which drove us to the duel in grave and exceptional cases when the service of the law became unavailing? If it is so, then we have before us, in persons guilty of duelling, harmless individuals. We should be using an excess and unjust zeal if we were to punish them in order to escape a danger which in reality does not exist. On the other hand, is it the office of the criminal law to correct morals? Assuredly not, for morals and laws follow the natural trend of things, and are both determined by environment. It is enough to recall that duels raged most in the countries where they were punished most severely, and that from the Middle Ages to our own time the number has decreased in measure as the laws against them became milder. But whoever believed that prejudices could be overcome by penalties? Have not the prejudices already gathered enough victims without having these useless punishments coming in and demanding new ones? The penal code ought to aim at defending society by purifying it from the evil race of criminals. Now the duellist, at least in most cases, is rather a victim than a criminal, and if on account of the means which science offers us, we are able to identify him as a criminal in those rare cases in which he is such, why should we offer him this honourable means of escape? If he is not a criminal, why should we punish him for being the victim of the very prejudices which we wish to eradicate? But the prejudice will either die, or it will be stronger than the law, and the penalties which, on account of their severity, will not be applied, will render the important efforts of the lawmaker all the more ridiculous. Subchapter 230. Adultery. In the matter of adultery again, the situation is much the same. That it should be punished as a crime in the canon law is doubtless justified, but in the modern code it can be classed at most only as a contravention. Adultery is assuredly immoral, and it is certain that if a law could prevent it by punishment it would be welcome, but that it could do so is not the opinion of the majority. Moreover, in this kind of trial, the victim suffers more than the culprit. It is useless, then, to have recourse in the law, and besides, the general and habitual impunity renders condemnation, in the rare cases where it takes place, all the more cruel. As Bernini rightly says in his magnificent monograph, Offesa e divisa, the law cannot oblige a woman to love her husband or the husband his wife. It can only safeguard rights that may be exacted materially and by force. Love is not a right that either one of a married couple can require the other, and the law cannot, in consequence, protect a right which does not exist for the person who claims to have been injured. Adultery, by dissolving their natural marriage, involves a moral divorce. Why should not also dissolve the civil marriage by a legal divorce? Why maintain forcibly the cause of the disturbance, while aggravating its effects by the useless scandal of a trial and a condemnation? Subchapter 231. Criminaloids. For criminaloids who are not recidivists and are without accomplices, it would be sufficient for the first time to suspend sentence, take security, and require the repayment of the damage by work where the culprit is not able to pay. This work should be in the fields where the offender is a peasant, or in the case of refusal to work, in a cellular prison. Subchapter 232. Homosexual offenders. Homosexual offenders whose crime has been occasioned by a residence in barracks, or colleagues, or by a forced celibacy, plainly will not relapse when the cause has been removed. It will be sufficient in their case to inflict a conditional punishment, for they are not to be confused with the homosexual offenders who are born such, and who manifest their evil propensities from childhood without being determined by special causes. These should be confined from their youth, for they are a source of contagion and cause a great number of occasional criminals. Subchapter 233. Other minor offences. Many other punishable acts could be transferred from the penal to the civil code for fines and payment of damages. In this class come the violation of private correspondence, damages caused by the property of another, and bad treatment of other members of the family who are not habitual or proceeding from depraved and truly criminal instincts. To this treatment we may add, in the case of husband and wife, separation, divorce. These disciplinary measures will be sufficient in the case of a violation of the duties proper to a public employee, and could be carried to the extent of dismissing him from his position. Simple threats, violation of domicile without criminal intent, insult, arbitrary taking of satisfaction, abuse of pastorage rights, and trespass will be sufficiently punished by payment of damages, which could very well be estimated by a civil judge. I would add to the list thefts of food of small value, provided that the small value of the articles stolen showed the occasional character of the offence. It is not a flagrant injustice that petty thieves, most often quite inoffensive children who have stolen fruit, for example, shall be punished as severely as real criminals who steal upon a large scale, or even more severely, since the latter often escape punishment altogether. I shall never forget how upon the day when 5 ministers of the realm of Italy rose as one man in open parliament to deny or to justify the thefts of Tanlongo and Company, running up to more than 30 millions. 7 children were sent to sweep for a month and a half in prison cells, having stolen a herring of the value of 35 centesimi. In the last case, I should wish to make a distinction between the really criminal gang having a common understanding and a minutely detailed plan, and that accidental semi-complicity which often has nothing criminal in it, being the effect of a simple caprice. The former I would punish very severely, while in the latter a simple reparation to the person injured with a reprimand or a conditional sentence would suffice. Subchapter 234. Complicity. The least dangerous criminals, those who are occasional criminals or criminals of passion, having for their psychological characteristic always to act alone without accomplices, it follows that complicity, at least in thefts, highway robberies, and murders, in the case of adults, must constitute by itself an aggravated circumstance, and every case should not be looked into, as it is now, merely to determine what share in the guilt each member of the band had, but should be taken as a distinctive mark of criminals belonging to the most dangerous classes. Subchapter 235. Habitual criminals. As to recidivists and criminaloids who have become habitual criminals, they should be treated like born criminals but subjected to a less severe discipline. Their crimes being almost always less serious: theft, swindling, forgery, etc. Further, while in the case of the born criminal the first crime is serious, it is sufficient to have him sentenced to perpetual confinement. In the case of the habitual criminal it is necessary, before determining upon this extreme treatment, to have the evidence of a number of recidivisms more or less great according to the kind of crimes and the circumstances under which they were committed. For the employment of these criminals there should be large workshops, for those who come from the cities and for those who come from the country, agricultural colonies and districts that need clearing, graded from the least to the most healthful according to the different categories of criminals. The colony of Castidas, which has created an oasis in the most insalubrious districts of Sardinia, and the miracles of the Trois Fontaines, prove how easy it is to put these organizations to practical use, diminishing the enormous expenses which respectable people have to pay for the punishment of criminals and at the same time making them of real service to the society which they have injured. Subchapter 236. The Criminal Insane. As for the criminal insane and the numerous born criminals in whom epilepsy and moral insanity manifest themselves clearly by fits of mental disturbance, the only proper treatment is confinement in a criminal asylum. By means of such an institution, we take away from the criminal who might feign insanity all desire to do so. We prevent a criminal heredity derived from the inmates. We put an end to their forming criminal associations, the criminal bands having almost all a prison origin. We prevent recidivism and cut down the enormous expenses of trials and the imitative crimes which often result from trials. Weidmeister objects that these asylums will do an injury to justice in case the patient becomes cured. In reply, we will remark in the first place that these cases are quite rare. The statistics of Broadmoor record about 5.5%. However this may be, the inconvenience may be remedied by granting liberty to those patients only who have shown themselves to be cured during a long period of observation. But as soon as a criminal has been recognized as insane, objects Falvet, he is not to be considered as a criminal, but resumes his status under the civil law. To this we reply that he cannot return to that status, because he has killed, ravished and stolen, and cannot therefore be put on the same plane as the harmless insane, for as long as the danger persists, the right of defense remains. Aside from this method of reasoning is derived from a class of ideas which science will from now on eliminate. That is to say, that while insanity is a misfortune, crime is a perversity of the free will. Now, just as men came to recognize a century ago, contrary to the beliefs of the Middle Ages, that insanity did not depend upon free will, we must now recognize that neither does crime itself depend upon it. Crime and insanity are both misfortunes. Let us treat them, then, without rancor, but defend ourselves from their blows. On the principle of the positive school, the objection cannot be maintained that the insane, so-called criminal comes under the civil law simply. He comes under the law of self-defense as much as the true criminal. For this reason the objection falls that the insane person cannot be detained for an indeterminate time, and that when he is cured, even before the expiration of the term which he would have passed in prison, in case of conviction, he has the right to go free. This objection cannot be admitted, considering the great number of relapses which have been shown to occur in all forms of insanity. There are misfortunes that are inexorable and grant only a short respite. Since we cannot deliver the individual from them completely, let us try at least to prevent the family of the hapless wretch, and society in general, from being victims. Furthermore, all the civilized nations show similar institutions. We have seen that in England they are already ancient. The criminal asylum exists also in Denmark, and has been introduced into Sweden and Hungary. In France, at the Prefecture of Police, there is a permanent medical commission whose duty it is to separate immediately from the other persons arrested those who appear to be insane. In 1870, a real asylum for the criminal insane was erected as a part of the central institution at Gallion. This department is kept under the discipline of the prison except as to the compulsory labour, and also as to the punishments, which can be inflicted only with the permission of physicians. Only those who have been sentenced to imprisonment for more than 1 year are admitted here, and they cannot be discharged without the authorization of the minister. All the other civilized peoples of continental Europe, if they have not regular criminal asylums, have laws and institutions which partly take the place of them. At Hamburg, Halle, and Bruchsal, the penitentiaries have infirmaries which are reserved exclusively for the insane, with gardens, secure cells, and a special discipline so that the insane can receive a continual care there, as in the regular asylums. Belgium law 1850 decrees that persons arrested, proceedings against whom have been suspended, for the cause of insanity, shall be consigned to asylums designed by the public minister. These asylums must have special wards for maniacal prisoners, accused or convicted, who cannot be mingled with the other patients, without special authorization from the Minister of Justice. The physician in charge is responsible for the escape of dangerous or criminal insane persons, and in case of flight must take all the necessary steps to recover them. A new law, La Loi Lejeune, 1891, requires the appointment of 3 alienists as special inspectors of prison to discover, isolate and care for the insane. In Hungary, a kind of medical senate composed of judges and physicians who are alienists is charged with pronouncing upon doubtful cases. We may say then, in summing up, that in these asylums there should be received, first, all prisoners who have become insane, if they have criminal tendencies; second, all the insane who, on account of homicidal or incendiary tendencies, pedestry, etc., have been subjected to a judicial procedure which has been suspended upon the delivery of their insanity; third, all those charged with strange or atrocious crimes committed without clear motive, in whose case has arisen the suspicion of insanity, or at least of a serious cerebral affection, is attested by 3 expert alienists. Fourth, in consideration of the extraordinary importance of epilepsy, all those who have committed crimes in a state of psychotic epilepsy, and criminals who have had epileptic fits. Fifth, all those who, being of general good reputation, are driven to crime by an habitual and evident infirmity, such as pellagra, chronic alcoholism, and perpetual diseases, especially where they have insane or epileptic parents, or show numerous marks of degeneracy. In this connection we see the property of having special criminal asylums for the alcoholic, epileptic, etc. The insane coming from the prisons must be isolated from the others and placed in separate wards in the infirmaries and next to the prison. The discipline should be severe for all, and the vigilance greater than in the common asylums, more like that of the prisons, but the work should be proportioned to the strength and alternated with long periods of rest and amusement. The direction should be medical, but the attendants should have prison training. Individuals who are recognized as habitually dangerous and have already been several times arraigned ought never to be liberated. Those who are affected with a transitory or intermittent form of insanity and show signs of a perfect cure should be selected for discharge after 1 or 2 years of observation, and subjected after their release to monthly medical visits for several years, as is done in Belgium. Subchapter 237. Incorrigible Criminals. We have seen that the best penitentiary system will not prevent recidivism, and that the individualized system has given unfortunate results in Denmark. On the other hand, we have seen that we have in the collective prisons the most frequent cause of repeated recidivisms and criminal actions. Further, what can one hope for the individuals, like those described by Brenton and Asperel, return to prison 50 or 60 times in a single year? Such persons evidently find themselves better off there than outside, so that for them prison is no longer a punishment, but a reward and an encouragement to corruption. When no method is of service any longer, when the criminal is insensible to all the pains taken with him and relapses 10 or 20 times, society ought not to wait while he perfects himself in crime by a new sojourn in prison, but should keep him shut up until assured of his reformation, or better, of his powerlessness to do harm. We should, for this end, establish special penal institutions to which a jury composed of directors, physicians, and judges shall consign all the individuals who, having from infancy shown an inclination towards crime, have relapsed several times, especially if they present those physical and psychical characteristics which have seemed to be masks of the born criminal. Even more important than the well-being of the inmate is the matter of making them useful, that they may not occasion too great an expense, and also the matter of preventing the possibility of escape. For this reason, islands or retired valleys offer the best locations. Here the prisoners may be occupied, if they come from the country, in work in the fields, which will be useful for their health and of advantage to the state, while those who come from the city may be provided for in workshops. Better still, disciplined military companies might be formed, as is the practice in Westphalia, and put to work to improve the roads and drain the marshes. They should be permitted daily to spend some hours according to their own taste, but they should be set at liberty again only after extraordinary proof of reformation. The cellular system should be inflicted upon them in the case of a new relapse. In this way the prison would become purged of those criminals who take pride in vice and render all attempts at reform there impossible. In this way we shall apply anew to society the process of selection to which is due the existence of our race, and also probably the existence of justice itself, since it was the elimination of the more violent that gradually allowed justice to prevail. However high the expense of all this may be, it will always be less than the cost of new crimes and new trials. Thompson calculates that 458 Scotch recidivists cost £132,000, of which £86,000 was for the cost of the trial alone. This proposition is not new, for in 1864 the House of Lords proposed to condemn criminals to penal servitude after a second recidivism. Elebist proposes that after the expiration of his sentence, every individual whose total sentences exceed 5 years, and who has relapsed for the 10th time, shall be permanently deported. The same reform is proposed by Bonneville, Tissot, and Doria Barini, and has already been put into operation in Belgium in the agricultural colony of Mexplas, which contains 4,500 individuals. The buildings of the institution were all erected by the labour of the convicts themselves under the superintendence of 30 or 44 men. Everything was constructed little by little according to the needs and resources, so that this magnificent establishment, which in other countries would have cost millions, has cost Belgium only the price of the land. Livestock multiplies upon the place, since the farms have their own bulls and stallions. The workmen are occupied only with the production of such things as have an easy sale, and the making of which they may be useful. The inmates are divided into 4 classes. First, those who are refractory or dangerous, contact with whom might be harmful to the other inmates. Second, recidivist convicts, under the surveillance of the police, those who have formerly escaped, and those who have had a bad record in the institution itself. Third, men whose antecedents have something to be desired, but have never had to undergo severe punishment in the institution. Fourth, those who have not been deported to the colonies more than 3 times, whose conduct might be considered as good. The communions sometimes send their paupers there, paying 65 centimes for those who are well, and 85 for the sick. Those who refuse to work are kept in a cell 3 days upon bread and water. The inmates are paid for their labour in a currency which passes over the institution, but is exchanged for real money when they are discharged. In this way the danger of spending money in the neighbouring hamlets is avoided. Subchapter 238. The Death Penalty. But when, in spite of the prison, transportation and hard labour, these criminals repeat their sanguinary crimes and threaten the lives of honest men for the 3rd or 4th time, there is nothing left but the last selection, painful but sure, capital punishment. Just as the death penalty is too largely inscribed in the book of nature, so it is in the book of history, and like all other punishments, it has a relative justice. Capital punishment assuredly ought to be found in the penal system of barbarous peoples, among whom prison does not inspire sufficient terror, but among civilized people the delicacy of feeling which wishes to abolish it is too respectable to be brushed aside, to say nothing of the fact that the singular prestige produced by a death inflicted in cold blood by judges, and at times met with bravado, often multiplies crimes by imitation and creates among the rabble a sort of worship of the unfortunate victim. But the opponents of this form of punishment do not think of asking, what means of defence is left to society against a man guilty of repeated murders who keeps his guards in constant danger of violation or death? Would it be more just or more humane to keep him bound hand and foot for life? Let no one advance the objection, with Ferry, that in order to make capital punishment effective, it must become a regular butchery, a thing repugnant to modern thought. To retain the death penalty is not the same as multiplying it. It is enough that it should remain suspended like the sword of Damocles over the head of the more terrible criminals, when after having been condemned to imprisonment for life, they have several times made attempts upon the lives of others. Under these conditions, there is no longer any weight to the otherwise fundamentally sound objection which is so often put forward, namely, that this penalty is irreparable. I should also wish to have this punishment retained when the social system of a country is menaced by associated crime under the forms of brigandage, the Camorra, etc. From this point of view, it seems to me that the civil conditions are absolutely equivalent to the conditions for which this penalty is reserved in time of war. What? Shall we be unmoved when by the right of conscription we condemn in advance thousands of men to an early death upon the battlefield, often for dynastic caprice or demagogic madness? And shall we hesitate when it is a question of suppressing some few criminal individuals 100 times more dangerous and fatal than a foreign enemy, in whose ranks a chance bullet may strike at Darwin or at Gladstone? Assuredly, if we take the point of view of strict abstract right, we do not believe ourselves to be God's vicars, and therefore have no absolute right over the life of our fellows. But unless this right comes to us with the necessity of self-defence, neither have we any right to deprive men of liberty or to hold them accountable for the least misdemeanour. To claim that the death penalty is contrary to the laws of nature is to ignore the fact that this law is written in the book of nature in letters only too clear, and that the very progress of the organic world is entirely based upon the struggle for existence, followed by savage hecatombs. The fact that there exist such beings as born criminals, organically fitted for evil, atavistic reproductions, not simply of savage men, but even of the fiercest animals, far from making us more compassionate towards them, as has been maintained, steels us against all pity. A love for animals, except among the fakirs of India, has not reached such a point that we are willing to sacrifice our own lives for their benefit. Here I can but recall the vigorous lines which Taine wrote to me shortly before he died. Where in the life of the intellectual, moral, and emotional organization of the criminal impulse is isolated, accidental, and transitory, we can and even ought to pardon, but the more the impulse is bound up with the entire fabric of the ideas and feelings, the more guilty is the man, and the more ought he to be punished. You have shown us fierce and lubricious orangutans with human faces. It is evident that as such they cannot act otherwise. If they ravish, steal, and kill, it is by virtue of their own nature and their past, but there is all the more reason for destroying them when it has been proved they will always remain orangutans. As far as they are concerned, I have no objection to the death penalty, if society is likely to profit by it. Many of the measures which I have advocated may appear contrary to certain ideal principles, which, while more noble than practical, are regarded by short-sighted intolerance as unassailable axioms. Further, they may be regarded by those who are frightened at the first cost as difficult to put into practice, but this is to lose sight of the economies which they would make possible in the future, especially if we should suppress, at least for recidivists, the costly and useless judicial proceedings based solely upon errors in form. In any case, they cannot be accused of endangering the public safety, which is the ultimate aim of all penal systems. End of section 30.